United Nations Office on Drug and Crime released a new report on 11 December 2024, which is titled Global Report on Trafficking in Persons since 2024. Today's podcast, we discuss mainly about human trafficking with this report, and complementary, we use some other reports and articles from Interpol and U.S. Department of State. We know there are several challenges on human trafficking. Some of them appeared on the surface on public. Anyway, always stay safe.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're zeroing in on the latest UNODC reports, especially that 2024 Global Report on Trafficking in Persons. Now, you guys are already deep in this world, so we can skip the Trafficking 101 and head straight for the insights that really matter to specialists like you.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah, this year's reports are particularly interesting. Both the U.S. State Department and the UNODC giving us a chance to see different angles on the same complex issue. And believe me, things are changing rapidly in the world of trafficking, technology, migration patterns, global crises. It's all shifting the landscape in ways we need to understand.
It's true, yeah. This year's reports offer a stark picture of how trafficking is evolving and shy away from highlighting the challenges we face.
Yeah. One thing that jumped out at me right away was the UNODC's focus on forced labor scamming, particularly in Southeast Asia. It's not just small-time stuff. The U.S. Institute of Peace estimates these criminal groups are pulling in a staggering 64 billion USD annually.
And that figure includes a whopping 3.5 billion USD from Americans alone. It's a clear sign that this isn't just a regional problem, it's hitting close to home for many of us.
Absolutely. The reports actually go into the factors that have fueled this surge in forced labor scamming. The pandemic obviously played a role, pushing more people online and creating economic hardship. But it's more than that. China's crackdown on cybercrime forced many criminal groups to relocate, and Southeast Asia became a prime destination.
That's a key detail. I think a lot of people miss this shift in criminal activity, combined with the rise of these incredibly manipulative pig butchering scams where victims are groomed online for months before being tricked into investing in fake platforms to create a perfect storm for exploitation. For our listeners who might not be familiar with pig butchering, it's a chilling term, that describes how these scammers fatten up their victims with attention and affection before ultimately exploiting them financially. Many of these victims are then forced into labor to repay their debts.
It's just awful. And the UNODC report backs this up. Forced labor is actually overtaking sexual exploitation as the dominant form of trafficking in some regions. But getting convictions in these cases, that's a whole different beast. The report states it takes a year longer to secure convictions in forced labor cases compared to sexual exploitation cases.
That statistic is concerning, but it highlights a crucial point that those working in this field, like our listener, are already well aware of. Proving coercion in forced labor is incredibly difficult, especially in sectors like agriculture or domestic work, where the exploitation is often hidden from plain sight.
Yeah, it makes you think about those. On-the-ground investigations. Imagine trying to gather evidence of forced labor in a remote cocoa plantation or a private home. It's not always as clear-cut as other forms of trafficking, and it requires a specific kind of expertise.
Absolutely. The U.S. State Department really hammers home the importance of victim-centered, trauma-informed interviewing techniques, particularly in forced labor cases. You need a specialized skill set to build trust and rapport.
With the survivors
who have experienced immense trauma.
Have you seen any shifts in your own work when it comes to training or resources for these types of investigations?
It's definitely something that's being discussed more and more in the field. And the State Department report makes a direct link between those specialized skills and successful prosecutions. They argue that policymakers need to prioritize this expertise when allocating budgets and developing training programs.
That's a critical point, especially considering the USF report even goes so far as to suggest sanctions against countries that harbor these criminal groups. We're talking a major shift in policy, one that could have significant implications.
For NGOs working in those regions, I'd be curious to hear our listeners' take on this. Have you seen any indications of this shift in policy within your own?
It's a question worth pondering, for sure, but we can't talk about the evolving landscape of trafficking without addressing the role of technology. It's a double-edged sword, as the U.S. State Department report aptly describes it.
On the one hand, technology is a powerful tool for traffickers. It's used for recruitment, grooming, exploitation, even moving money through cryptocurrencies to evade detection. It's a game changer in many ways. but not for the better.
One thing that struck me in the reports was the discussion of cryptocurrency's role in facilitating these crimes. It really underscores the need for experts in the anti-trafficking field to be up to date on the latest technological developments. How can we combat financial exploitation if we don't understand the tools being used?
You're right. The financial aspect is often overlooked, but it's crucial. Think about it. You're likely seeing the impact of fintech on anti-trafficking efforts already. How is this technology changing the way you approach investigations or support survivors?
Well, it's a whole new set of challenges, and it requires us to think differently about how we approach investigations, data analysis, and even victim support.
But let's not forget the flip side. Technology can also be our greatest ally in this fight. We're seeing incredible advancements in data analytics that can help us identify trafficking networks, predict patterns, and even disrupt financial flows. There are also new investigative tools being developed to track perpetrators and gather evidence online.
It's like a digital arms race, isn't it? We need to be constantly evolving our strategies and harnessing technology to stay one step ahead. I recently spoke with a survivor who was connected with legal aid through a mobile app specifically designed for trafficking victims. It completely changed her trajectory. It's amazing to see these kinds of innovations emerge.
That's a perfect example of how technology can empower survivors, and it ties in perfectly with the UNODC's emphasis on victim reintegration. Think about the potential of mobile banking platforms to provide survivors with financial independence and security, or online educational resources that can help them rebuild their lives.
It's about giving survivors agency, not just immediate aid. It's about recognizing their strength and resilience and providing them with the tools they need to thrive, not just survive.
And social media, don't underestimate its power. It can give survivors a platform to share their stories, connect with others, and advocate for change. We're seeing a real shift in how survivors are using technology to reclaim their narratives and become powerful voices in this movement.
It's moving beyond the traditional, rescuing the victim narrative and recognizing survivors as agents of change, experts in their own right. But as we delve deeper into these reports, it's clear that the world's facing some pretty significant challenges: climate change, conflict, displacement, all of which are fueling the vulnerability that traffickers prey upon.
The UNODC has done some fascinating research on this, particularly in Africa. The report dives deep into how the continent's unique context, think poverty, conflict, and weak governance, creates a breeding ground for exploitation.
So how is this playing out on the ground? What are the specific challenges that stand out in the reports?
Well, for one, we see alarmingly high rates of child labor in certain African countries. The UNODC cites figures like 42% in Nepal, 39% in Côte d'Ivoire, and 25% in Kyrgyzstan. These numbers are staggering, and they highlight the urgent need for intervention.
And it's not just about rescuing children from exploitative situations. It's about understanding the underlying factors that drive families to make these heartbreaking choices in the first place. Poverty, lack of educational opportunities, conflict, it's all interconnected.
And then you have industries like gold mining, where forced labor is rampant. It's driven by the demand for resources, weak environmental regulations, and corrupt practices. The UNODC report explicitly links trafficking to the depletion of Africa's natural resources, painting a bleak picture of how greed fuels exploitation.
We often talk about conflict and displacement as drivers of trafficking, but these reports really highlight the role of climate change as well. As climate events become more frequent and severe, people are forced to migrate, often ending up in desperate situations where they're incredibly vulnerable to exploitation.
It's a sobering reality, and it emphasizes the need for a holistic approach to anti-trafficking efforts. We can't just focus on law enforcement or victim services. We need to address these broader issues of climate change, poverty, and inequality if we truly want to make a dent in this problem.
The U.S. State Department report takes a closer look at the Americas, where we see a different set of challenges. They specifically call out Cuba's labor export programs, raising concerns about exploitation and coercive conditions.
It's a controversial issue, and the report doesn't shy away from highlighting the potential for abuse. They cite examples of Cuban medical workers abroad facing restricted movements, withheld wages, and threats of retaliation if they try to leave. It's a complex situation with serious human rights implications.
And it's not just about individual exploitation. The report points out that these practices can actually undermine healthcare systems. In host countries, we're talking about instances where workers are forced to falsify medical records or misrepresent their qualifications, putting patient safety at risk.
It's a reminder that trafficking isn't just a crime against individuals. It has far-reaching consequences that impact entire societies.
And we can't talk about the Americas without acknowledging the role of migration, which is often intertwined with trafficking. You have people fleeing violence, poverty, and persecution, making them incredibly vulnerable to exploitation along their journey.
The State Department report stresses the importance of improved screening processes. For migrants, it's about identifying potential victims of trafficking early on and ensuring they receive the support they need. It's about seeing them as individuals with rights and needs, not just as numbers in a system.
It also emphasizes the need to address the root causes of migration: poverty, inequality, lack of opportunity. If we want to truly prevent trafficking, we need to create pathways for safe and legal migration, not just build walls and increase enforcement.
It's about tackling the systemic issues that drive people into desperate situations in the first place. And that requires a level of collaboration and political will that we haven't always seen in the past.
And speaking of collaboration, the UNODC report really dives deep into the need for more robust data collection and analysis. It's a theme that runs throughout the report.
You can't solve a problem you don't understand.
Right, and the UNODC is calling for a more comprehensive and nuanced approach to data collection, especially when it comes to forced labor, which is often hidden and underreported.
They even introduced this concept of the invisible victims, those who are never detected, never rescued, never counted in the statistics. It's a chilling reminder that the numbers we see in these reports likely represent just the tip of the iceberg, and it underscores the need for innovative data collection methods. Think about leveraging technology to gather information from online platforms, social media, and even the dark web. We need to be creative and strategic in our approach.
And it's not just about quantity, it's about quality. We need more granular data about trafficking patterns, recruitment methods, the profiles of both victims and perpetrators. This kind of information can help us develop more targeted interventions and allocate resources more effectively.
The UNODC is actually calling for greater collaboration between governments, researchers, and civil society organizations to improve data collection and analysis. It's about sharing information, developing standardized methodologies, and creating a more accurate picture of the global trafficking landscape.
It's about building a knowledge base that can inform policy, guide interventions, and ultimately help us prevent this crime from happening in the first place. But prevention is only one piece of the puzzle. The UNODC also offers some concrete recommendations for strengthening the criminal justice response to trafficking.
They're advocating for a more sophisticated approach, one that recognizes the complexity of trafficking and the unique needs of survivors.
So what does that look like in practice? What are some of the specific recommendations they highlight?
Well, a major focus is on specialized training for law enforcement and judicial personnel. The report emphasizes the importance of trauma-informed approaches, victim-centered interviewing techniques, and a deep understanding of the often subtle dynamics of coercion and exploitation. It's about equipping those on the front lines with the tools and knowledge to not just identify trafficking, but to do so in a way that minimizes further harm to the victim.
It's about recognizing that the legal process itself can be re-traumatizing for survivors. We need a system that is truly sensitive to their needs, not just focused on securing convictions.
Absolutely. And the U.S. State Department report echoes this sentiment. It stresses the importance of ensuring that victims feel safe and supported throughout the legal process, not pressured to participate in prosecutions. If they're not ready or willing.
That's a crucial point. It's about recognizing that healing takes time and that not all survivors will want to pursue legal action against their traffickers. The justice system should be a resource for them, not an added burden.
Precisely. And the UNODC goes beyond just improving prosecutions. They also advocate for stronger international cooperation, recognizing that this is a transnational crime that requires a coordinated global response.
We're talking about breaking down those jurisdictional barriers that often allow traffickers to operate with impunity. It's about sharing information, coordinating investigation, and streamlining extradition processes.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing that many countries, especially those most impacted by trafficking, simply lack the resources to effectively combat this crime. The UNODC calls for increased funding for anti-trafficking initiatives, both domestically and internationally.
It's an investment in a safer world, plain and simple. And it's
Yeah.
something that those of us working in this field,
Yeah.
like our listener, need to be constantly advocating for. We need to make sure that policymakers understand the human cost of inaction.
That's where I think the real power of these reports lies. They don't just present data. They connect that data to the human stories behind it. They remind us that these aren't just numbers, they're lives, families, communities impacted by this crime.
It's easy to feel overwhelmed by the scale and complexity of the issue. But the UNODC report, to its credit, doesn't end on a note of despair. It emphasizes that change is possible, that we have the tools and the knowledge to make a real difference.
Absolutely. It highlights the progress that's being made, the increased awareness, the stronger legislation in many countries, the growing collaboration between governments and civil society organizations.
And it emphasizes that it's not just about big sweeping changes. It's about the individual acts of courage and compassion. The teacher who recognizes the signs of trafficking in a student, the social worker who provides unwavering support to a survivor, the journalist who exposes the truth about these criminal networks.
It's about each of us using our skills, our platforms, our voices to contribute to this fight in whatever way we can. It's about recognizing that even small actions can have a ripple effect.
And I think that's a powerful message for our listener. You're already deeply engaged in this work, likely seeing the challenges and the triumphs firsthand. These reports offer valuable insights and recommendations, but it's ultimately up to those on the ground, like you, to translate those insights into action.
It's about being a constant learner, adapting to the evolving landscape of trafficking and finding creative solutions to complex problems. It's not easy work, but it's vitally important.
Well said. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, but one thing is clear. The fight against trafficking is a marathon, not a sprint. It requires sustained effort, collaboration, and a willingness to constantly learn and adapt.
And it's a fight worth having. The stakes are simply too high to ignore this issue. So as we wrap up, we want to leave you with this thought. What will you do with your expertise and your passion to contribute to a world free from exploitation?
It's a question worth pondering. Until next time, keep diving deep. Well, it's a whole new set of challenges, and it requires us to think differently about how we approach investigations, data analysis, and even victim support.
But let's not forget, the flip side, technology can also be our greatest ally in this fight. We're seeing incredible advancements in data analytics that can help us identify trafficking networks, predict patterns, and even disrupt financial flows. There are also new investigative tools being developed to track perpetrators and gather evidence online.
It's like a digital arms race, isn't it? We need to be constantly evolving our strategies and harnessing technology to stay one step ahead. I recently spoke with a survivor who is connected with legal aid through a mobile app specifically designed for trafficking victims. It completely changed her trajectory. It's amazing to see these kinds of innovations emerge.
That's a perfect example of how technology can empower survivors, and it ties in perfectly with the UNODC's emphasis on victim reintegration. Think about the potential of mobile banking platforms to provide survivors with financial independence and security, or online educational resources that can help them rebuild their lives.
It's about giving survivors agency, not just immediate aid. It's about recognizing their strength and resilience and providing them with the tools they need to thrive, not just survive.
And social media, don't underestimate its power. It can give survivors a platform to share their stories, connect with others, and advocate for change. We're seeing a real shift in how survivors are using technology to reclaim their narratives and become powerful voices in this movement.
It's moving beyond the traditional rescuing the victim narrative and recognizing survivors as agents of change, experts in their own right. But as we delve deeper into these reports, it's clear that the world's facing some pretty significant challenges. Climate change, conflict displacement, all of which are fueling the vulnerability that traffickers prey upon.
The UNODC has done some fascinating research on this, particularly in Africa. The report dives deep into how the continent's unique context, think poverty, conflict, and weak governance, creates a breeding ground for exploitation.
So how is this playing out on the ground? What are the specific challenges that stand out in the reports?
Well, for one, we see alarmingly high rates of child labor in certain African countries. The UNODC cites figures like 42% in Nepal, 39% in Côte d'Ivoire, and 25% in Kyrgyzstan. These numbers are staggering, and they highlight the urgent need for intervention.
And it's not just about rescuing children from exploitative situations. It's about understanding the underlying factors that drive families to make these heartbreaking choices in the first place. Poverty, lack of educational opportunities, conflict, it's all interconnected.
And then you have industries like gold mining, where forced labor is rampant. It's driven by the demand for resources, weak environmental regulations, and corrupt practices. The UNODC report explicitly links trafficking to the depletion of Africa's natural resources, painting a bleak picture of how greed fuels exploitation.
We often talk about conflict and displacement as drivers of trafficking, but these reports really highlight the role of climate change, as well as climate events become more frequent. And severe people are forced to migrate, often ending up in desperate situations where they're incredibly vulnerable to exploitation.
It's a sobering reality, and it emphasizes the need for a holistic approach to anti-trafficking efforts. We can't just focus on law enforcement or victim services. We need to address these broader issues of climate change, poverty, and inequality if we truly want to make a dent in this problem.
The U.S. State Department report takes a closer look at the Americas, where we see a different set of challenges. They specifically call out Cuba's labor export programs, raising concerns about exploitation and coercive conditions.
It's a controversial issue, and the report doesn't shy away from highlighting the potential for abuse. They cite examples of Cuban medical workers abroad facing restricted movements, withheld wages, and threats of retaliation if they try to leave. It's a complex situation with serious human rights implications.
And it's not just about individual exploitation. The report points out that these practices can actually undermine healthcare systems in host countries. We're talking about instances where workers are forced to falsify medical records or misrepresent their qualifications, putting patient safety at risk.
It's a reminder that trafficking isn't just a crime against individuals. It has far-reaching consequences that impact entire societies.
And we can't talk about the Americas without acknowledging the role of migration, which is often intertwined with trafficking. You have people fleeing violence, poverty, and persecution, making them incredibly vulnerable to exploitation along their journey.
The State Department report stresses the importance of improved screening processes for migrants. It's about identifying potential victims of trafficking early on and ensuring they receive the support they need. It's about seeing them as individuals with rights and needs, not just as numbers in a system.
It also emphasizes the need to address the root causes of migration poverty, inequality, lack of opportunity. If we want to truly prevent trafficking, we need to create pathways for safe and legal migration, not just build walls and increase enforcement.
It's about tackling the systemic issues that drive people into desperate situations in the first place, and that requires a level of collaboration and political will that we haven't always seen in the past.
And speaking of collaboration, the UNODC report really dives deep into the need for more robust data collection and analysis. It's a theme that runs throughout the report.
You can't solve a problem you don't understand, right? And the UNODC is calling for a more comprehensive and nuanced approach to data collection, especially when it comes to forced labor, which is often hidden and underreported.
They even introduced this concept of the invisible victims, those who are never detected, never rescued, never counted in the statistics. It's a chilling reminder that the numbers we see in these reports likely represent just the tip of the iceberg.
And it underscores the need for innovative data collection methods. Think about leveraging technology to gather information from online platforms, social media, and even the dark web. We need to be creative and strategic in our approach.
And it's not just about quantity, it's about quality. We need more granular data about trafficking patterns, recruitment methods, the profiles of both victims and perpetrators. This kind of information can help us develop more targeted interventions and allocate resources more effectively.
The UNODC is actually calling for greater collaboration between governments, researchers, and civil society organizations to improve data collection and analysis. It's about sharing information, developing standardized methodologies, and creating a more accurate picture of the global trafficking landscape.
It's about building a knowledge base that can inform policy guide interventions and ultimately help us prevent this crime from happening in the first place. But prevention is only one piece of the puzzle. The UNODC also offers some concrete recommendations for strengthening the criminal justice response to trafficking.
They're advocating for a more sophisticated approach, one that recognizes the complexity of trafficking and the unique needs of survivors.
So what does that look like in practice? What are some of the specific recommendations they highlight?
Well, a major focus is on specialized training for law enforcement and judicial personnel. The report emphasizes the importance of trauma-informed approaches, victim-centered interviewing techniques, and a deep understanding of the often subtle dynamics of coercion and exploitation. It's about equipping those on the front lines with the tools and knowledge to not just identify trafficking, but to do so in a way that minimizes further harm to the victim.
It's about recognizing that the legal process itself can be re-traumatizing for survivors. We need a system that is truly sensitive to their needs, not just focused on securing convictions.
Absolutely. And the U.S. State Department report echoes this sentiment. It stresses the importance of ensuring that victims feel safe and supported throughout the legal process, not pressured to participate in prosecutions if they're not ready or willing.
That's a crucial point. It's about recognizing that healing takes time and that not all survivors will want to pursue legal action against their traffickers. The justice system should be a resource for them, not an added burden.
Precisely. And the UNODC goes beyond just improving prosecutions. They also advocate for stronger international cooperation, recognizing that this is a transnational crime that requires a coordinated global response.
We're talking about breaking down those jurisdictional barriers that often allow traffickers to operate with impunity. It's about sharing information, coordinating investigations, and streamlining extradition processes.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing that many countries, especially those most impacted by trafficking, simply lack the resources to effectively combat this crime. The UNODC calls for increased funding for anti-trafficking initiatives, both domestically and internationally.
It's an investment in a safer world, plain and simple, and it's something that those of us working in this field, like our listener, need to be constantly advocating for. We need to make sure that policymakers understand the human cost of inaction.
That's where I think the real power of these reports lies. They don't just present data, they connect that data to the human stories behind it. They remind us that these aren't just numbers, they're lives, families, communities impacted by this crime.
You know, it's easy to feel overwhelmed by the scale and complexity of the issue, but the UNODC report, to its credit, doesn't end on a note of despair. It emphasizes that change is possible, that we have the tools and the knowledge to make a real difference.
Absolutely. It highlights the progress that's being made, the increased awareness, the stronger legislation in many countries, the growing collaboration between governments and civil society organizations.
And it emphasizes that it's not just about big sweeping changes. It's about the individual acts of courage and compassion. The teacher who recognizes the signs of trafficking in a student. The social worker who provides unwavering support to a survivor. The journalist who exposes the truth about these criminal networks.
It's about each of us using our skills, our platforms, our voices to contribute to this fight in whatever way we can. It's about recognizing that even small actions can have a ripple effect.
And I think that's a powerful message for our listener. You're already deeply engaged in this work, likely seeing the challenges and the triumphs firsthand. These reports offer valuable insights and recommendations, but it's ultimately up to those on the ground like you to translate those insights into action.
It's about being a constant learner, adapting to the evolving landscape of trafficking, and finding creative solutions to complex problems. It's not easy work, but it's vitally important.
Well said. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, but one thing is clear. The fight against trafficking is a marathon, not a sprint. It requires sustained effort, collaboration, and a willingness to constantly learn and adapt.
And it's a fight worth having. The stakes are simply too high to ignore this issue. So as we wrap up, we want to leave you with this thought. What will you do with your expertise and your passion to contribute to a world free from exploitation?
It's a question worth pondering. Until next time, keep diving deep.